to be here. Thank you, Mike, for that terrific introduction. Thank you, Leah, just for showing up for moral support. I appreciate it. It is good to be here today for the Blue-Green Alliance, and I just want to thank you all for inviting me here and giving me this chance to speak. I love being here. I love being here with all of you, because we got a future. We got some work to do. You know, we do. So we face a serious employment problem in this country. Not enough good jobs to support a rising median income and a strong middle class. We also face serious environmental issues in this country. Not enough momentum to build toward clean energy to ward off the devastating impact of climate change. I'm here today to argue that both problems grow from the same roots and they both share a similar solution. First, I want to start with the backstory. From the founding of this country until the 1900s, America pretty much took the economic world the way it was. Booms and busts were just the way things were, and there wasn't much that we could do about it. But when the Great Depression hit, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up with a bold idea. We can fix it. We believed that we could tame the beasts of the market, the beasts that caused it to inflate and then come crashing down. And that is exactly what he and his generation did. They put in place 3 laws. First, make it safe to put money in banks. That was FDIC insurance. Second, put cops on the street, not just Main Street, but Wall Street. And that was the SEC. And third, separate the banking system, checking accounts and saving accounts, from the risk-taking on Wall Street so that taxpayers would never be called on to bail out if things got bad. And that was Glass-Steagall. Those 3 rules, think about that. Those 3 rules were in place for 50 years, and they brought us economic peace. There were no economic crashes, and the financial services industry served the American economy rather than the other way around. Now, the second part of the backstory is what we did during this time of economic peace. We built a future. We made big investments in the things that would create opportunities for everyone and move our country forward. We invested in education, public schools and universities, a GI Bill, NDEA loans, all to make sure that our kids could get a good education without taking on mountains of debt. Yes, we did. We invested in infrastructure, in roads and bridges and power grids, so that businesses could get their goods to market and so that workers could get to their jobs. And this is the remarkable one as a country. We invested in research, in medical research and scientific breakthroughs, sometimes where the outcomes seemed impossible, like putting a man on the moon, or sometimes when we didn't even know what would come of it, as in the case for the research that ended up developing the internet. We invested together and we built a future together. We embraced the idea that we're all in this together, and that meant supporting strong unions. Think about it this way. Strong unions pushed for better wages and better working conditions for their members, but they also pushed for better working conditions and better wages for all people, union or not. Unions were there on the front lines in the fight for a minimum wage. They were there in the fight for Social Security. They were there in the fight for Medicare. They were there in the fight for the Voting Rights Act. Corporations already had a powerful voice in Washington. Unions made sure that working people had a voice too. And here's the thing, it worked. It worked. From 1935 to 1980, 90% of America, that is everybody who's not in that top 10%, 90% of America got 70% of all income growth in this country. We were a country of opportunity, a country that worked for working people. We should give that a round of applause, don't you think? Now, the environmental story is a little different, but I want you to watch for the similarities. Coming out of the Great Depression, our economic growth and development was incredible, and it was important, creating opportunities to expand and strengthen America's middle class. But it also had costs. We didn't address the pollution. From factories, cars, and trucks, the pollution that was spewing into the air. We didn't address the pollution in rivers and lakes. We didn't think much about the toxic waste in the ground beneath our feet. And then, in the 1950s, we passed laws to begin to address air pollution. And through the 1960s and the 1970s, as more voices spoke up, we created the Environmental Protection Agency. We passed the Clean Air Act. We passed the Clean Water Act. We protected endangered species, and we started cleaning up toxic waste sites. We did those things because we believed in the future, and we knew that our children and our grandchildren could not live in a world where they couldn't breathe the air and drink the water. So that brings us to the late 1970s. Much work still to be done, but we were headed on the right path. And then, in 1980, the political wind shifted. Instead of a New Deal, instead of a pro-union government, instead of a basic contract that said we'll all pitch in and build opportunity for the next generation, the Republicans claimed they had a better way to build a future. Basic trickle-down economics. Yeah. Step one, always watch what the heart of trickle-down economics was about. Step one, cut taxes for those at the top. Let those with money keep more of it. It was classic trickle-down economics, but those tax cuts meant less revenue. And that meant less investment in education, in infrastructure, and in basic research. Less investment in building opportunities, less investment in building a future. Step two, fire the cops. Not the cops on Main Street, the cops on Wall Street. The Republicans called it deregulation, but it meant more financial speculation, more risk, and eventually the great crash of 2008. Deregulation also meant get rid of any rules that are in the way of a company's short-term profits. And that began a concerted effort to delay, to stop, and to roll back environmental protections. And then, step three, fight anybody who got in their way. And that meant doing everything possible to break unions everywhere and anywhere. Weaker unions not only meant higher corporate profits, weaker unions also had a powerful political impact, leaving working people without an advocate, no voice to balance against corporate interests. And 35 years of Republicans driving the national agenda has had a real impact, a devastating impact. Education, well, public universities are starved for money, so that, adjusted for inflation, a kid today who goes to a state university will spend about 325% of what her mom or dad spent just 30 years ago. Infrastructure. Well, the impact of not investing in infrastructure is catching up with us. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that the cost to repair our crumbling roads, bridges, and power grids now adds up to a staggering $3.4 trillion. Think about that. And research. As a percentage of GDP, federal investment in research has been sliced by 40%, and we are losing a generation of young scientists who can't get funding. Protecting our Earth, over the past 30 years, we've learned far more about environmental threats, more about the impact of carbon in the atmosphere, and yet we haven't seen any major legislation on climate change. And what happened to the economic well-being of families? What's happened in 30 years of tax cuts for the rich and more deregulation? Well, remember the 90%? The 90% that from 1935 to 1980 got about 70% of income growth? Well, from 1980 to 2012, that 90% got 0% of income growth. Think about that. The top 10% got 100% of the income growth under Republican trickle-down economic policies. They got it all. I want you to think for just a minute about how the world would look different if we had taken a different approach over the last generation. Think what would have happened and what would be happening today if instead of special tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, instead of subsidies and fancy tax loopholes for giant multinational corporations, what if everyone had paid their fair share and we had put that money into investing in our infrastructure, in roads and ports and transit and power grids? With regular federal money going to transportation, for example, how much better would our roads be today? How much more innovation might we have seen in responsive mass transit, in urban bike trails, in 21st century streetcars, or in park and ride combinations? With regular federal money going to the power grid, how much more efficient would we be today at storing energy, making all green energy far more viable? With regular federal money, what would be different today? We know that climate change and extreme weather are going to require improvements in infrastructure to prepare our cities for storms and flooding. Think how much further along we would be if we had been investing all along in making those improvements. And one more critical point. Think how many people we would have put to work. Think how many people over the last 35 years would have been put to work. Think of the design jobs, the delivery jobs, the materials jobs, the jobs of every kind. You know, just consider one example on this. In 2014, the 5 biggest oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, BP, and ConocoPhillips, those 5 together made combined profits of $90 billion. All those profits, but they also sucked down $5 billion in subsidies from the American people. Think about that, $5 billion a year. $5 billion a year, year after year after year. What if instead of funding profitable oil companies, we had invested $5 billion more this year in educating our children or in scientific research that could lead to energy breakthroughs? With $5 billion more in the mix year after year, how much further would we be along with wind farming or with installation and biofuels? What else might be different? How different would the world look if instead of fighting over Republicans' deregulation no matter what approach, Congress had focused on how to make regulations smarter. Now, I understand there are a lot of people who think that regulations bring higher costs, and in many cases, they are right. But regulation is also about making sure that someone doesn't get to beat out the competition because they're dumping filth in the river or spewing poisons in the air. When done right, regulation makes sure that everyone has a level playing field and the costs of producing a product are borne by those who get the profits, not by the children who can't drink the water and can't breathe the air. Yep. And look, when done right, regulation can spur innovation. Consider the catalytic converter. I love this example. When the Clean Air Act was passed back in 1970, it imposed stringent environmental standards, standards that at that moment no one had the technology to meet. But with new rules in place, we figured it out and we built it. Sure, there were delays and modifications to the regulations, but the push and pull of regulations and compliance helped create new innovations. And in the end, we ended up with technology that significantly reduced pollution. Or think about regulations that require greater transparency or disclosure. Studies have shown that a simple disclosure about how much energy a family is using, you know, the smiley face or the frowny face on a bill, can actually nudge families to lower their energy consumption. Smart regulations are not the enemy of markets or of economic growth. Smart regulations give people information so they can make their own choices. Smart regulations keep the playing field level and help ensure that markets really work. Now let's bring it all together. Good. So let's bring it all together. Labor blue and environmental green. If we had spent billions on infrastructure instead of tax cuts, there would have been jobs, good jobs for millions of people, and infrastructure ready for the climate challenges of the future. If we had invested in research, we could have made advances to spur the economy, to transform energy technology, and to create more demand for workers. So why didn't we do those things? Things that would have given us better jobs and a more sustainable future. We didn't do them because Washington isn't working for workers. Washington isn't working to build a future for our children and our grandchildren. Washington is working for the richest and the most powerful, those who can hire armies of lobbyists and lawyers. The rich and the powerful have rigged the game, and they plan to keep it rigged. Lower taxes for them, fewer investments in building a future, fewer regulators to tell them that they can't cheat people or dump poisons in the rivers. They fight for an America that works for them and that leaves everyone else behind. They have concentrated money and concentrated power, and those are huge advances. But we have a huge advantage on our side. We have our voices, and we have a lot of them. Think about it this way. Ask how many Americans think that big corporations should pay their fair share of taxes. Ask how many think we should rebuild our roads and our bridges. Ask how many think that we should hold Wall Street accountable. Ask how many think we should stop big corporations from polluting our rivers and oceans. The numbers are on our side because the people are on our side. And let's be clear, when we're talking about these issues, when we're talking about the people, not the politicians in Washington, but the people on our side, it's Democrats, it's Republicans, it's independents, it's libertarians, it's vegetarians. It's people who say enough of Washington working for the rich and powerful. We want a government that works for the people. That's what we're here for. You bet. And that is exactly why we are here today. That's why blue and green come together. We are here today because when we are together, we are stronger. A strong labor movement can stand up for working families and for more investments in infrastructure. Labor can do that. And a strong environmental movement can push for closing tax loopholes and supporting sane regulations. The pieces fit together. I don't kid myself. We are up against some powerful interests, and we will not win every fight ahead. But I want to remind everybody in this room, Goliath won battle after battle after battle until David picked up his slingshot. The way I see this, the folks in this room, we got to pick up our slingshots and go after Goliath. It is good to see you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you.